Hi, I'm Juliet Parker, Director of ALNAP, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of our latest evidence synthesis on supporting mutual aid. This event comes at a difficult moment for the humanitarian sector. We're facing politically driven funding cuts, rising needs, and growing frustration with the pace of reform. Nearly a year after the dismantling of USAID, the sector is still working out how to allocate scarce resources and whether this moment calls for a reset or a more fundamental rethinking of how international aid should operate. Alongside this sobering context, there's been a noticeable rise in interest in mutual aid within parts of the international system. At first sight, these trends can seem at odds. On the one hand, crisis and retrenchment, and on the other, curiosity about informal and community led responses. Today's conversation starts from the idea that these dynamics may in fact be closely linked. You'll hear findings from our research, as well as a range of perspectives on the risks and opportunities of supporting mutual aid. And of course, there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. At a time when the learning landscape is shifting significantly in the humanitarian sector, I hope today's session provides useful and important food for thought. And with that, I'm delighted to hand over to Alejandro.
Hello, and thank you very much for joining our event. My name is Alejandro. I am a research fellow at ALNAP, leading our work on mutual aid. We are really excited to be launching our latest published synthesis on supporting mutual aid. This report is the first output of an ongoing 2-year research project where we will create multiple spaces to meet, learn, and discuss on this topic. As Juliet referenced earlier, we are amidst a very bleak scenario for the humanitarian sector. However, there has also been a rather encouraging attention by some actors within this international system on mutual aid. We argue that this may be because the two are more connected than we thought. Because what if better connecting the international system to already existing mutual aid efforts through which communities support one another can be part of the solution of how we reset and reprioritize the system? What is mutual aid? This is not a straightforward question. Last October, we spent 2 days in Bangkok with researchers and practitioners trying to answer it. And as you can see from the pictures in the slide, there's no single or simple definition. However, for the purpose of our research, we define mutual aid as the self-forming, self-organized, and voluntary ways in which individuals, families, and communities support one another during crisis. Anecdotally, during that workshop, there was a shared sense that although mutual aid is hard to pin down conceptually, when you experience it in your own context, you know it when you see it. This picture above is from Bogota, Colombia, which is where I'm from. During the first few months of the pandemic, a spontaneous but organized system of mutual support emerged. Across the city, and particularly in low-income neighborhoods, people who were struggling began hanging red shirts or pieces of clothing from their door to signal for help. It created a shared language that allowed others like me to know where we could drop off groceries or medicine. For me, this is a clear example of mutual aid. So now the question is to understand the evidence around how international funding can support mutual aid efforts. We realized this was fundamentally about a relationship between two systems. On one side, the organizations from the formal humanitarian system, and on the other, the mutual aid efforts themselves. And like any relationship, there are two sides or dimensions to this interaction. The first looks at the results experienced by mutual aid efforts as a result of support provided via international funding. And the second looks at the results experienced by formal actors as a result of the interactions that they have with mutual aid efforts through their support. Both dimensions form the basis of the report and its findings. SCLR, or supporting community-led response, emerged as the most common way through which mutual aid efforts in humanitarian contexts are currently receiving international funding. What is SCLR? The diagram from the report that you see on the slide presents our interpretation. In a nutshell, and without doing justice to the full level of nuance, SCLR is an approach or methodology through which international actors can provide support to existing mutual aid groups or initiatives. In very broad terms, international actors work with local facilitators, who are usually local or national organizations, who then identify existing mutual aid initiatives and invite them to apply for support. The support requested is not limited to microgrants. It can also include demand-led capacity strengthening, horizontal and vertical connections, and support for coordination. What is key is that the support, whatever form it takes, is characterized by flexibility, by being demand-led, and by a conscious effort to share risks and power. So back to the research. We first set out to identify all existing evidence on outcomes of supporting mutual aid with international funding. Initially, we expected that the evidence base was going to be very limited, as we had repeatedly heard that most of it was anecdotal or poorly documented. However, we expanded our scope and included internal evidence from those local facilitators. This gave us access to over 200 documents from more than 25 countries, all of which form the basis for the analysis. So what did we find? Well, first, on the results experienced by mutual aid groups as a result of international support. The first finding is that support, when provided in the right way, was often seen to strengthen rather than undermine the areas that mutual aid is already inherently good at. These areas include resilience and sustainability, dignity and quality, and relevance. Resilience and sustainability were strengthened when support was forward-looking, demand-led, and deliberately focused on long-term thinking, collective action, and networking. Rafiqul Islam, a local facilitator of the SCLR approach in India, gives us an example.
From HCLR, we could intervene activities in a different way. It is a break from the traditional way. It is no more a top-down approach. We go to the communities and find community activities and then try to explore possibilities. For an example, villagers were facing severe flood erosion. Land, home, and even livelihood had been threatened by severe erosion. People were trying to protect their banks from the perennial river, dumping this and that natural materials and all. So when talk to them, they wanted certain support like improvisation, and we suggested them some technically advanced method of activity. So that's how we introduced bamboo screening. While resources were raw materials and labor had been supplied by the community, we complemented their activities by supporting them with technical part, and that's how we could protect the community themselves, could protect the village, and besides protecting their banks, they could reclaim land. This is one of many, and these have been furthered by some kind of resilience.
Quality and dignity were linked to support that was holistic, enabled local decision-making, and centered social cohesion. For example, in Turkey, community reported improved mental well-being and a greater sense of resilience as a result of exposure to increased social solidarity, particularly where SELR supported mutual work between communities that used to be at tension with one another. And finally, relevance was maintained when support was flexible, informed by local and traditional knowledge, and when it promoted wider community involvement. Maria Elena Cerato provides a powerful example from the Philippines.
The principle of bayanihan is deeply embedded in Filipino culture. When you mention bayanihan, many Filipinos picture neighbors literally carrying a house together to transfer it to another place. Everyone lifting, moving in unison, working as one body. It's the spirit of communal unity and cooperation, where neighbors come together to help one another without expecting anything in return. Supporting community led response, or SCLR, simply provides a framework and tools to strengthen what Filipinos have always done naturally. It's about recognizing that communities are already saving themselves and are the best experts on their own priorities. What's been truly exciting is seeing how local government units, or LGUs, are beginning to recognize the value of this approach. One promising progress is how our partner EcoWeb, a national NGO based in southern Philippines, secured co-funding agreements with 6 LGUs. Each LGU commits 1 to 2 million pesos, or 20 to 40,000 dollars, which EcoWeb matches with equal funding. This isn't just about money. It's about a fundamental shift in how government works with communities. The question isn't whether government support is good or bad. It's about whether communities can maintain their autonomy and leadership within these partnerships. In Socorro, Siargao, for example, a sea ambulance project started entirely from community resources. Typhoon survivors pooling their own small grants. That collective action was the foundation. Additional funding and government linkages came after, supporting what communities had already initiated. What sustains mutual aid, communities' collective effort, their knowledge of their own priorities, their willingness to organize and act together. External support, including the governments, can contribute to this sustainability when it respects community leadership and doesn't impose rigid structures that undermine local autonomy.
A second key finding is that international support can help demystify common concerns raised by funders when engaging with informal or mutual aid structures. These concerns usually relate to accountability, inclusion, and cost efficiency. The evidence suggests that support to mutual aid can deliver positive results across all of those three areas, challenging assumptions about the limits of informal structures. Accountability concerns often focus on elite capture, corruption, or weak oversight. However, the evidence indicates that accountability can be strengthened when support simplifies upward compliance and prioritizes strong, diverse, and community-led forms of downward accountability. For example, in Sudan, the F system, developed by the emergency response rooms, surprised donors with accountability mechanisms that were often more thorough and grounded than those that donors would have designed themselves. A common inclusion concern is that mutual aid might reproduce existing power dynamics or exclusion. However, the evidence shows that when support promotes inclusive leadership and collective net benefits, particularly through women-led initiatives, it can actually counter exclusion rather than reinforce it. Nancy Khatib from YMCA Palestine, who have been supporting community-led response via protection groups, explains.
Rural and Bedouin communities, women's roles were traditionally limited to household work like farming and herding, and participation in community protection groups led to profound social transformation. A woman from protection groups, one woman joined a rural protection group as a shy member who rarely spoke. Over time, she began leading discussions, represented her community in meeting with institutions, participated actively in planning processing, negotiated for community rights. She later became a member of the village council for the village council and eventually the head of a council committee. She once said, I didn't only leave my house, I left fear. This transformation resulted in increased trust from men, public support from her family, shifts in social norms, movement from role conflict to partnership. And today, many women who served in protection groups hold position in local councils, serve a council presidents or committee heads, are recognized leaders in planning and risk management. That women's participation in local governance leads leads to more inclusive and equitable outcomes. The success stories from Palestine prove that inclusion and accountability are not theories. They are roads open, women leading, and communities standing strong. Community protection groups didn't only change projects, they changed people, reshaped how communities see themselves, and prove that when communities lead, they create real and lasting change.
Finally, funders also questioned whether informal structures are cost effective or can reach economies of scale. However, the evidence suggests that mutual aid groups are often highly efficient at sourcing inputs and implementing activities. And because support builds on existing community action, financial and in-kind contributions from the communities themselves actually frequently exceed external funding. However, despite the largely positive findings, there are several caveats and limitations that need to be considered. Where unintended consequences were identified, they were often linked to cases where support reverted to top-down ways of working. It is also important to note that reporting on unintended consequences was limited, and much of the evidence is self-reported, which raises concerns about possible confirmation bias. And finally, we found very limited discussion on scale, particularly around if support should be scaled, how to scale it, whether you scale it up or out, and how to do this without undermining what makes mutual aid effective in the first place. Now on the findings from the results experienced by those supporting mutual aid. We link this dimension to the system change potential of supporting mutual aid, and I want to explain briefly why. International and formal humanitarian actors usually work within well-established structures. This includes fixed roles, standardized funding mechanisms, compliance requirements, and predefined ideas about leadership, implementation, and accountability. They are also part of a wider system that's shaped through professionalization and specialization, which has produced stable and predictable ways of working that are different. However, our data shows that mutual aid follows very different logics. It is fluid, relational, grounded in everyday social life, and able to change form depending on the context and need. This creates a clear mismatch because in order to genuinely support mutual aid, international actors cannot simply fit it into existing categories. They often need to rethink their own roles, relationships, and operating rules. So our hypothesis is that while these shifts begin at the program or pilot level, over time, some may influence internal organizational practices. And if enough interconnected actors change in similar ways, and if these changes accumulate across organizations supporting mutual aid, this could contribute to a gradual reconfiguration of the international humanitarian system. So the core question for us is whether and to what extent and how supporting mutual aid can contribute to system change or system reset. Evidence on this dimension was much more limited, but there are some promising early signals. Changes were observed in how organizations learn, make decisions, build partnerships, and engage in advocacy as a result of supporting mutual aid. Learning became more adaptive and multidirectional, including peer-to-peer learning and learning from community practices. Decision-making shifted in terms of who influences, how and when support is provided, including shifts between donors, INGOs, national actors, and communities. Partnerships became more trust-based and equitable, and advocacy efforts increasingly focused on promoting SCLR and broader system reform. Endalkacha Yargel, director of the national organization Citizen to Citizen in Ethiopia, explains how supporting mutual aid has influenced their own work.
You know, in my country, Ethiopia, facing multiple crises that are including climate shocks, civil conflict, displacement, and economic food insecurity. Yet even in those challenges, people continue to show remarkable solidarity by sharing resources, supporting one another, and rebuilding together. This pushed us to rethink the aid delivery system, moving away from top-down approach to embrace citizen-driven systems that foster local capacity and solidarity. The experience has led us C2C, citizen to citizen, fully embrace a similar approach, which now we see communities not as a beneficiary, but as a leader. Our role is to catalyzing their strengths, respect their agency, and protect the space for local innovation to thrive, with the vision to create a resilient community that confidently shapes their own future. Instead of asking them to participate in our project, we ask to participate in theirs. Peer-to-peer learning is now spreading organically. Group visit one another and sharing methods and adapting ideas and inspiring communities. We advocate for policies that empower mutual aid groups, reduce dependency, and build the future with resilience. A system that recognizes their agency and supports their leadership for long-term development is critically important.
Despite the positive findings once again, there are key evidence gaps that remain. First of all, there's limited evidence of changes in technical areas that are critical to localization, such as compliance, due diligence, and accountability system. Also, most documented changes are still at the pilot and SCLR level, with very little evidence of organizational and system-wide transformation. And finally, the evidence primarily reflects changes amongst local and national organizations with far less documented changes among international actors. We know that this has been a lot of information, and the report itself has a lot more details and examples. But if there are 4 key messages that you should take away from this first report, is that first, the current attention on mutual aid appears justified by the promising evidence that we identified in this synthesis. Second, supporting mutual aid may not only help prioritize scarce international funding, but could also contribute to resetting how the system operates towards a more people-centered and locally led one. Third, the outcomes experienced by mutual aid depend not just on how much support or funding is provided, but on how that support is designed and delivered. And finally, and most importantly, as support grows, it must be accompanied by independent and critical analysis to ensure that it does not end up undermining what makes mutual aid effective in the first place. On that note, we will now transition to the second part of the event today, where we have invited some of the key stakeholders that are supporting mutual aid to reflect on some of the most pressing unanswered questions. So as I mentioned, for this next segment, we wanted to feature conversations with key stakeholders that have been supporting mutual aid on some of those pressing and unanswered questions that remained from the evidence synthesis. However, we wanted to do this a bit different. So we've invited them and asked them to react to specific provocative statements that we've provided on those topics. On the first segment is really around that central question of how do actors make the decision to prioritize support to mutual aid in what is a very financially and structurally drained humanitarian system? For this, we invited Federico Mocta, who is the head of emergencies and humanitarian at the Vito Foundation, as well as Rurik Marston, deputy director for humanitarian policy and partnerships at FCDO. Both of these organizations have taken the decision to support mutual aid in the middle of the financial context. Vito Foundation is an anchor donor for the Resilio Fund, and FCDO has decided to directly support the ERR system in Sudan. So we've asked them to respond to the following statement.
So we've got a statement to respond to, and it is the following: funding mutual aid is difficult but not impossible. I might say quickly, like, for me, the statement immediately made me think, like, I wish that the difficult could be replaced with challenging. I don't think funding future mutual aid is difficult, but it certainly has its challenges. But yeah, what's your sort of response?
Yeah, a bit the same actually. I looked at it and I thought that's a very well, it's very much it's a kind of donor perspective in a way, right? Because actually there are lots of other people who find funding through mutual aid mechanisms quite easy. I mean, sort of, it feels to me like there's a kind of an ecosystem of things going on in complicated humanitarian situations, and you know, communities find ways of supporting each other, diasporas find ways of supporting communities. There's a complicated and exciting set of things going on, and sometimes we find it challenging to be part of it, but it's very much there and it's very much happening, and it's very, very real and important in the lives of people.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think what I like about it is that it challenges us in the international community to sort of really think about our position, and sort of who it is we're supporting. I always felt that we've tended to look at humanitarian action as something that is where the first and last responders tend to be the organizations supporting communities, and I think the framing around mutual aid as communities being the first and last responders is a small nuance, but like it's fundamental, but therefore requires us to think about how we engage what our role is, and in particular, what it is that communities are asking of us. Because if we accept that they're responding and they're already active in their own response, therefore we also have to think about, okay, well, what assets, what resources have they got? And as you say, oftentimes those resources are coming from very diverse players that aren't ever considered within the humanitarian framework. So I think like the challenge to us as a community offering sort of international solidarity is thinking about how best to align the funding flows to the kinds of incentives that sort of build on what communities want and are doing, and maybe the key difficulty for funders and sort of the wider system to think about how you enable it to really sort of to be supported at a scale that makes sense, but without undermining the very sort of things that make it work. Sudan is sort of the first real example of this happening at a larger scale. I mean, it's sort of where we connected between the sort of philanthropic side that I represent and your side with FCDO. I mean, sort of what was the key sort of unlocking the opportunity for FCDO to get behind some of the mutual aid efforts in Sudan?
I think it's a really interesting question. And I think it's a sort of a variety of different things. And my sense is that we're still on a bit of a journey, but part of it was about finding, or kind of being forced in a way to identify mechanisms that allowed us to get behind these ways of working, which were kind of clearly there and were clearly reaching people at times when the kind of more externally driven mechanisms really weren't. So I think really exciting kind of shifts around, for example, the use of group cash transfers, really exciting kind of the shifts around the development of new intermediaries to help find ways of getting funding to the emergency response rooms. And I think there's always going to be a challenge, right, between how do you get scale up right while respecting the kind of modalities and approaches of local partners. How do you get how do you make sure that accountability is very much with communities, but that the kind of accountability that you need as an external kind of bilateral donor to parliaments and taxpayers can work? And how do you just understand and navigate these very complicated political contexts within which people are operating and working, and kind of having to find ways of reaching the communities that they're working in and with and for?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us the really interesting bit around, or the thing that sort of really unlocked opportunities from our point of view in Sudan, was the fact that ultimately sort of everyone talks about a demand-led approach, in a sense, for how international solidarity can support mutual aid and mutual aid initiatives. And I think what Sudan really clearly demonstrated was the ability of local practitioners to sort of take support initially provided by sort of other volunteers who sort of have operated on both sides, let's say, and really take it forwards and develop something that fit their requirements, their needs, because ultimately they also were thinking about questions of accountability and transparency, and in really challenging operating environments. And sort of the F system, this reporting framework that was developed, was, I mean, it's unique in the sense of that it really was created by the Sudanese civil society groups that represent mutual aid, the ERRs in particular. But it meets their needs whilst also ticking a lot of the boxes that sort of ultimately enable funds to flow, right, and for risk to be manageable in relation to sort of the accountability that you need to maintain towards your stakeholders. So I think things, it just goes to show where you create the opportunity for systems and processes to also be co-created as opposed to sort of imposed, which has been sort of more the model to date. Sort of really interesting dynamics ensue and ultimately allow for the kinds of structures to be in place that enables more support to flow.
I think it'd be good to get your perspective on like how do we get the sort of, you know, the comparative advantage and the kind of energy of the foundations and the kind of you know, the donor approaches to kind of co-create a bit more and maybe kind of drive more innovation and more exciting ways of support.
Yeah, no, I think you know, if Sudan showed us anything, is the fact that there are sort of really good positions, or sort of there's an interesting sort of role for all of us to play. I think, you know, at the end of the day, the foundation space considers itself more risk taking, so sort of potentially the space that can allow for early investments into processes and give the mutual aid actors the space they need to co-design, right? And that doesn't, even amongst volunteers, it comes at a cost, and needs to be tested and you know and modified and rethought out as action occurs. And I think that kind of flexibility is what we're able to offer to then help establish the kinds of structures that would enable then others to come in.
This conversation, Mickey, is making me think of other things, but I think I was also, as you were talking, I was also reflecting on this kind of, there's a real challenge, right, about getting the story and the experience out and helping to kind of catalyze different ways of thinking. So one of the things we've been trying to do in FCDO is set up a community of practice so that we're trying to catalyze between different country contexts where people have done approached kind of the shift to locally led responses and mutual aid in different ways. You know, how do you take that and make it into a you know, more kind of institutionally applied practice? But there's also a bit of a challenge around the kind of often the desire to build awareness and the importance of managing exposure. That's not so bad kind of internally within FCDO, but once you start to push things out more publicly, how to make sure that we were behaving in ways that were not adding extra risk to our partners by increasing their exposure or, you know, talking in some way about what they were doing.
Why it is challenging is that you have to constantly, anyone engaging and wanting to offer solidarity or support sort of needs to think about what their actions might unfold. You know, even, I think, again, I mean, constantly going back to Sudan, but again, like the visibility has been critical for them, but it's also made life challenging in parallel, and it has sort of raised protection concerns. Given that these are civilian populations out there without sort of necessarily the umbrella of an entity or an institution that sort of offers them some protection. I think an important one, sort of as anyone thinks around sort of how to fund and support mutual aid, needs to sort of always bear in mind the difficulty isn't in getting the money out necessarily. It's about getting the support right.
This second conversation segment is really around the question of systems change. And as you saw in my presentation, we're very interested in understanding how supporting mutual aid might lead to some systems change. However, there's also a real question of the risks associated when those involved in providing support are not willing to change in the process. So for this conversation, we've invited Gloria Donate, the head of humanitarian aid at the IMS Foundation, and also Sima Karasmanozgul, executive director of Support to Life in Turkey. Both of these organizations have been supporting mutual aid. The IMS Foundation is also an anchor donor of the Resilio Fund, and Support to Life is a Turkish national organization that has taken the SCLR approach and supporting mutual aid and transformed itself as a result. So we've asked them both to respond to the following statement.
Hi, Sema. I wanted to read out you a statement, and I'm really curious your thoughts on it. You should not support neutral aid and not expect to be changed by it. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Gloria. Well, that is quite a provocative statement. We have been tremendously changed by facilitating community-led work, and it's become a very critical part of the work that we do. So we're a humanitarian organization, and we work primarily in response to crises. And we have been running huge programs. We came to a point where we felt that this wasn't the right way to move forward, especially after the forest fires in Turkey in 2021. And we thought, oh, the affected area is so big and communities are so diverse. And how would we ever be able to go in, carry out a needs assessment, identify, come up with a design of an intervention? So community-led work was something that I had been following. And we thought, well, let's pilot with communities, identifying their own needs and coming up with their own action on whether they want to respond to the forest fires or whether they want to be better prepared for the next round. And since then, it's been tremendous in terms of how it has shifted our own thinking, our own programming, and the way we learn from the work that we do.
And what was the hardest for you as Sema or your organization in terms of the changes since you adopted this approach?
Well, of course, it was a mind shift. I mean, a culture shift of how we undertake humanitarian action, because as aid actors within the system, we tend to do things on behalf of affected communities. So for us, it was a real shift in terms of how do we let communities themselves identify needs and come up with their actions and actually make use of the funding that's available. So for us, it's been really critical in terms of how we understand the different actors and especially affected communities themselves. And it's been challenging also in terms of working with donor partners that have provided the funding for this, because it was, we needed to be lighter on compliance. We needed to have less rules and regulations. We needed to have a different understanding of accountability. Community within the accountability is very, very different. And that's been a challenge as well. And I know that your foundation has been very supportive. So maybe how was it for you to take that decision and to be able to to decide that we are able to take less risk?
I think we were in certain regards more favorable because we're a new foundation. We were established 5 years ago. So I think there was all the colleagues that are working the foundation had a desire for change. We don't know how or what that looks like, but we definitely agree that we need to do things differently. So for us, for my side as head of humanitarian aid, I had been following the events in Sudan, sadly, and of course, mutual aid and community-led responses in many countries. But of course, the great and inspiring work of the emergency response rooms in Sudan was such an inspirational event that caught our attention. And we thought, okay, we definitely need to support. But then the question was, how do you support those more informal responses without undermining? Because as you said it, right, donors, sometimes with the best intentions, we do have, these boring things called due diligence and compliance, and you didn't want to undermine those efforts. So I think what we found is that there's diverse pathways. We support national NGOs that are enabling mutual aid. We support feminist funds and feminist actors, which I think have been doing mutual aid in different shapes and forms for years. And we are now one of the anchor donors to Resilio. So we think there's different ways to support mutual aid efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Gloria, because for my organization also, and for me personally, actually, with the World Humanitarian Summit, we started talking about we need to localize aid if we're going to make it more effective, more efficient, more accountable. And at that time, we were very active as Support to Life during the build up to the World Humanitarian Summit, and it resonated really strongly with us. The messages on localization. But at the time, for me, localization was about us because we were, national as a national NGO, and we needed to access more funding and we needed to have a seat at the table. But over time, and it's been 10 years almost since the World Humanitarian Summit, we've been talking so much about localization. And now I've come to understand that localization is so layered, it's so nuanced, and there are, of course, among civil society organizations, different layers and diversity, as you mentioned, organizations, but in fact, affected communities themselves can step up, and they are a critical stakeholder when we talk about local actors. And this was a realization that after we realized, hold on, we're actually an intermediary ourselves, but we do challenge the different intermediaries that are active within the humanitarian system. But it really is, we felt like the deeper we go, like there's a deeper localization that we have to tap into. And for us, it's been tremendous in terms of really understanding that we are also power holders, because we were challenging those that were holding power. But for us, that understanding of how we have to share what we have. So it's not about us accessing the funds and the resources and being at the table, but it's about how do we get affected or at-risk communities, because we tend to think post crisis, but SCLR work also gives us the opportunity for communities to prepare, to reduce risks, to work on climate action, to build resilience. So it's quite a diversity of actions that you can take. And that has really broadened us, helped us look beyond the humanitarian silo and really have a deeper understanding of what we call local itself.
That makes a lot of sense. I agree. I think even for donors, right, it's this localization and it's always reductive to amount of funding and overheads and who gets the money, but not about the ethos behind, right? People centered and what are communities themselves. So I think there's also a lot of learning there for donors. And I think the last point you made is something that I find incredibly inspiring with mutual aid is the creativity. You have to approach this change being open-minded, right? I mean, the sector and donors, of course, I think it's an interesting what the humanitarian means or doesn't, right? And I think that's what is interesting with mutual aid, because you could look at it from very different angles. Is the governance piece, right? Is it a more immediate response in a particular crisis? Then is it livelihoods? Is it and I feel that is where all of us, right? I mean, NGOs and donors have to trust that those more proximate and going through that crisis know what is needed and with who they need to collaborate and what is that change. Maybe the last question I had, Sema, is so what I observed with some of our national organizations we support is that they enable SLR, and then the other half, in my words, traditional programming, and they navigate these two approaches. So I'm curious how Support to Life, are you now, all of the work you're doing is to enable mutual aid? Is some of them, again, traditional or a kind of more NGO work?
Yes, well, that is a contradiction internally, for sure, Gloria, because it is a different mindset, right? How you approach mutual aid and how you deliver your own project outputs. We have been moving more and more in that direction, so doing more in mutual aid work. But I also have to say that what we have learned from supporting communities undertake their own work has really enabled us to think of, in terms of our own programming, to think of how we can pull elements of those into our other work. And we've had actually our facilitators, our community facilitators, a part of our project team. They are really working with the other project managers, saying, look, why don't you think of this instead of this? Why do you have to, like, kind of challenging them why they feel that they have to control and they have to deliver and it's their responsibility. So really internally, teams have been talking about, we have a component here. We work with UNICEF, which on a program for children. How about we do this child-led? To what extent can we actually hand over to children? Or we have a lot of GBV programming work under our protection program. So, teams have been challenging, well, how about we make this a women-led initiative? And it's been quite interesting. Also, we talk a lot about inclusion, and it's really expanded our approach on we no longer ask who should be included. We now ask who is not in the room and why don't we hear their voice. And for us, this has really, really been a good shift in terms of transforming our other programming as well. So yeah, that's actually been one of the great outcomes of having adapted mutual aid work.
Excellent. As you said earlier on, right, is a change in mindset, and that takes time.
Our third and final conversation is around a topic that's very important for the future of this research project, which is the question and the issue of scale. How do you scale support to mutual aid in a way that doesn't undermine what makes it effective in the first place? So for this really important conversation, we've invited Fanta Toure, the CEO of the Resilio Fund, as well as Tarini Ross, the head of humanitarian programs at Humanitarian Aid International in India. As we know, the Resilio Fund is an attempt to scale support to mutual aid and community-led response across various contexts. And Humanitarian Aid International in India has been working through a network approach that proposes a different avenue in which support can also be scaled. We have asked them both to react to the following statement.
Fanta, we've been asked to reflect on this statement, which I read out here. The traditional sector doesn't have the sensitivity to scale support to mutual aid without compromising what makes it so valuable. Your thoughts on that?
I think, okay, first of all, and to be fair in this conversation, my thinking is that we are in completely uncharted territories. It's probably the first time ever that the conversation about deeply looking at mutual aid and then scaling it is happening. So we have to give ourselves grace getting into that conversation. And number two, I think the bottom of this conversation is actually how we bring two fundamentally different cultures together. I choose to believe that mutual aid existed before traditional aid. I think mutual aid is actually rooted in a human imperative to show up for each other and help each other and show solidarity to each other. And you do it for members of the family, you do it for your neighbors, you do it for your cousins, because you understand that your own, and you understand it intrinsically, that your own survival is linked in the survival of the other person. So it's that level of deep solidarity. Mutual aid is organic, it's flexible, it changes, it responds to the need of the moment. Mutual aid leans on trust and looks at risks in terms of shared accountability and shared responsibility, and looks at results in the same way. And then you have traditional aid, which I think came from outside to help. And there you already have a little bit of a difference, because I think the notion of wanting to help already acknowledges the difference and doesn't necessarily own to the link between your personal survival to the survival of the person that you're trying to help. And so that notion of helping is good, it's generous, but it's also external. And when you look at the codes and operating systems and cultures and social norms of traditional aid, it is more rigid, and it's used rigidity in the name of efficiency. It is more rooted in power over, and I think it uses power over in the name of accountability and in knowledge of, in a conversation or in basic assumptions about where knowledge and expertise lies. And I think traditional aid relies on control and also a self-centered understanding of risk. And that manifests as a certain way of looking at results and compliance. Now, these are harsh words, but we can agree on we can choose and pick what we believe is factual and what is not. And so I think bringing these two together is obviously going to be hard and it's not going to be easy, but I think that what the current moment is asking of us is asking us to decenter traditional aid. It's asking the conversation, the question rather, to be mutual aid exists, period. Traditional aid is having its own humanitarian crisis. What does mutual aid need from external actors who want to support it? And what is going to be helpful and what is not going to be helpful? And from that conversation, traditional aid can do its work on how it needs to reinvent itself. I don't like the word reform. I don't like the word reset. I think it's something fundamentally different that needs to emerge from the moment. And that's what we're being invited to reflect on. I don't know, that was a lot. And I'm just curious, what did this question, what did it call in you? How did you react to it?
And that's so interesting, Panta. Even for me, I think the statement does resonate to a certain extent. I love that you said the traditional aid sector is something that is external, and even recognizing us and this conversation we are having. I'm not representing a mutual aid group, and yeah, we are also outside of that. Yes, we are trying to see and explore ways to strengthen and support it, and we're learning and unlearning a lot of things, but also recognizing. Who has these conversations also, right? And with, I think even the term traditional aid sector, like what does that mean also, right? That mutual aid, like you said, is part of many traditions and cultures and the way people intrinsically want to help each other, especially in times of crisis. And we're really, I think now as a sector, just recognizing it. And now we are seeing more attention, and that's why more, drive to support it. But again, I love that the statement is also asking us to think about how can we do this more sensitively in a way that we don't end up harming, the thing that we're trying to support with the best intentions, as well-meaning as the sector is as well. So for us, I think being a representative of a local network, I also see that with the overall sector being very much business-like structured, it is this aid industrial complex, but also seeing genuine civil society, frontline organizations that in their histories were like mutual aid networks and groups that became formal and institutionalized and now are, grassroots civil society organizations supporting their communities. And that's what we've also been trying to explore, that if we do try to strengthen and scale mutual aid, how can we reimagine our roles? And really, maybe look at our own relevance as well in the overall scheme of things. And how can we do that with those that are actually closest to the communities? So
what you said resonated so much. There's a piece that came out to me on unlearning and how far in the complex does the unlearning go? Because I think that a lot of national NGOs have also adopted the language of what we're calling traditional aid. And so it is unlearning to be done at many different levels. And what does reprogramming looks like when you center what the first responders are doing and how they are organizing and what result means to them and what risks looks like for them, I think will provide ripple effects that will be healthy for everyone in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
I'm very curious. You said strengthen and scale. What does scale look like for you?
So for us, again, we are trying and, like you said, learning and doing a lot more unlearning. And for us, the approach we have taken is to do it through a network approach rather than, just one organization trying to scale, because it does, in our experience, it doesn't work. And that's, I think, what we're trying to leverage, that our collective strengths and working with a network of grassroots organizations that are already rooted in their communities, the leaders of whom, are community members themselves and are very deeply invested in everything they do. And just to support frontline organizations to find mutual aid groups where people are already doing something to help each other, and what more could be done, and how can we do that in a complementary way, and even challenging ourselves from not only being community based but following community led approaches and what that could look like. And while we are trying, where there are challenges or failures, sharing that amongst each other. I love what you said about, giving ourselves grace that we are exploring new territories, but having that space and trusting each other while we're trusting communities as well to lead this, to share and learn from each other, and then keep adapting and growing from that. And I would love to hear also, with the Resilio Fund and your perspective as a funder, what advice would you also have for others who are exploring, how they could scale their support to mutual aid networks and groups? Yeah.
I think being willing to do it progressively and to deeply listen. But there's an element of humility in this, to say we don't have the expertise. We have some expertise, and they do have some expertise, but they will tell us, or they will show us what expertise they need from us, and we will deploy that as a fundamental reshift in the way we have of thinking and of doing things. And if you realize that you are not doing, but you are supporting, then that does force you to be staffed in a certain way. It forced you to change your procedures in a certain way. And that, I think, is the conversation that I think needs to happen.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all the audience for all the very engaging questions. We now want to have a few minutes of a question and answer segment so that you get the chance to listen to most of our speakers. Unfortunately, Tarini was not able to join us today, but we will also be relaying the questions to her. So there is a lot of questions in the chat. We've selected a few so that our speakers can go through them. And we wanted to start with Gloria and ask Gloria, where do you draw the boundaries between mutual aid and locally led action? Is there an overlap? What is gained by naming mutual aid explicitly instead of using the broader locally led framing?
Thanks, Alejandro, and hi, everyone. I think it's interesting. I can give an easy answer of how I think, right? For me, self-organized, local populations that are experiencing particular crisis, right, leading their own actions, and is more spontaneous, and you're not a registered organization necessarily. But I think we do spend a lot of time, and especially in the humanitarian sector, to come with very set definitions. This is mutual aid, this is SLR, and I do think there is a lot of risk with that. And also what I was saying earlier in the conversation with Seman, who gets to be a humanitarian and not as a humanitarian. And I think some other colleagues, participants were saying in the chat about how this is not rocket science, right? We could look at development sector, I look at human rights activists and social movements and indigenous work, and they've been doing this forever, right? And again, this is not something that happens for some of us far away in Sudan. It happens in Europe, happens in the US, it's our neighbors. So I think we often like to make things very technical and complicated, and things are far more natural. Having said that, I understand we all have departments and organizations to represent, and you have mandates, and that is where I think we try to categorize and understand. But I personally do not get bogged down by this. I just see who is doing genuine local efforts to try to respond in a way that is those people affected deciding what's best for them and how to do it, and us as funders trying as much as possible to get behind them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria. Rurik, the next question is for you. And we wanted to, there was a question in the chat about what parties do you receive most resistance from when supporting mutual aid initiatives? Is it co-founders, taxpayers, or the public? And what have you found to be the most effective way to explain or show to them that mutual aid is effective?
Right, so I think to be really honest, I haven't seen a situation where we've got a huge pushback on mutual aid. I think what you see is a lot of questions and a lot of kind of uncertainty, because as you develop new ways of working, you have to kind of understand new approaches. And to me, I think the best way of making the case is the voices of the communities or the organizations themselves. And I think that's the really important thing, is giving people the platform and the space to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. To explain, I think it comes back to something that Gloria was saying before, that, you know, the needs of communities are not necessarily kind of a narrow humanitarian silo. They're a kind of a more integrated, facing a more integrated reality, which includes peace, it includes the impacts of climate, it includes humanitarian needs. You know, it's a broad set of issues. And I think that actually that connecting people to the voices of the communities is the best way of unlocking the creativity that you then need to generate to find ways of dealing with the myriad problems that you face, the myriad challenges around understanding, you know, donor frameworks, and how do you make them appropriate, and how do you deal with risk in an appropriate way, and how do you get accountability and reporting right so that it works for both communities and donors. But it seems to me that's a process that you need to start from a kind of a common understanding of what you're trying to achieve and what it is that communities are trying to achieve.
Thank you very much, Rurik. The next question from the audience is for Federico. And this is a question about the reset. And it asks, what would a genuine reset of the humanitarian system look like in practice when working with mutual aid? For example, how might compliance, accountability, or funding processes need to change to accommodate community-led approaches?
Thanks, Alejandro, and hi, everyone. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, I think I would piggyback off of what Fanta mentioned in her own intervention earlier. I mean, we need a fundamental transformation of the system, and essentially picking up on the fact that if we agree and recognize that mutual aid is the sort of central pillar of a response, and then we sort of look at all of the tools we have at our disposal within both the humanitarian system and then, you know, as people in the chat mentioned and Gloria mentioned as well, like look at all of the various tools across sectors, across themes, right, that we all have, and reimagine them with that central truth. So, I mean, just thinking even about coordination structures, you know, how if we stick to a kind of thematically driven reset that still collects information and manages data and makes decisions through clusters or you know, or structures that were very institutional, then we're going to be essentially missing the point on the reset. I think what we need to go back to is take every single element, break it down. How does it fit within a mutual aid reality? And then reconstruct it, because I don't think we don't have the answers. I think we do have them. It's just a question of like for whom those tools, who those tools are serving, and not sort of, and usually that tends to be within a hierarchical but an upward-looking system, but equally a very institutional one. So my hope for a sort of reset would be one in which we sort of revisit everything about the system, reframe the central notion around, okay, how do we build around this reality, and then sort of pick the right ingredients from those tools that we have to support that, and thinking always in terms of what the added value is.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Federico. Fanta, you wanted to come in, but there's also a question for you.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I don't know if the format allows to add, but I do want to add what Federico says. One of the things that is me about this conversation is that there are great people everywhere. I think when we get caught into criticizing the system, sometimes we don't realize what our allies within platforms that are less flexible than philanthropy allows are doing to change their system. And there's an opportunity for us to think about how we come together on one team in figuring things out. And the other thing that resonates also from what I heard both from Gloria, Federico, and Sima is that we have to open ourselves to the possibility of a new world. And that new world is here. And what does that mean then to step into it? And it requires courage and bravery. And the other thing that stays with me that I want to mention in answering this question on what does reset look like is I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, and we certainly shouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater. And so they are within our institutions, and don't quote me on this, but I think, for example, that defense has the most flexible way of moving resources. So there's a way to do it. Showing up with curiosity on how they are able to make it happen within the system can give us a hint on what systems allow. Women movements and women funding space has learned about how to be more flexible in moving money. What are lessons that we can take from there and readapt them to the world that we now have to step in are some of the things that are sitting with me.
Maybe can I just mention
Thank
one
you
thing
very
around?
much.
Sorry, Alejandro. Can I just say really quickly on the question of like, I see a lot of bits around safety nets, accountability, and all that. I think we have to also recognize that mutual aid operates at a much higher level of transparency as a baseline than a top-down system can ever do. I mean, inherently, there are relationships. I mean, it's all of the evidence lies from all the way back in the day when we started out with microfinance programming and looking at how social capital sort of supported people to pay back on time, and and all of that work in Bangladesh and the Grameen Bank, etc. back in the day. I mean, it's all there. It's proven, right? I don't think we have to question the basis. It's just a matter of figuring out how do we use what we have and the various positions that we all hold in the system to support one another to be to just amplify the accountability, improve the transparency, think about like who might be being left behind, because nothing is perfect, right? So let's accept the imperfections and sort of see how we can collectively therefore organize to make it that little bit better. And I think if we start from that basis, instead of sort of trying to aim for perfection in a way, right, which is sort of the downward or sort of the top-down accountability model, I think we'll probably find ourselves in a better position as an outcome, but equally we're less likely to fail along the way.
Thank you very much, Federico. So I guess on a related note, but also a bit different, and I think this question was quite interesting, and this is for you, Fanta. But it's the question was, how can mutual aid and SCLR, and it was in quotation marks, be sold better to the politicians and decision makers that shape the formal humanitarian system? And then there's a second question, which I think is key, which is, or is it better not to? And thus supporting mutual aid actually demand developing another type of system. So I think, as Federico was mentioning, and the evidence from the synthesis shows, there is a lot of positive findings, both about mutual aid itself and the outcomes that come from supporting it. But there's also a lot of risks associated with the people involved of what happens when that support comes. So Fanta, do you have any reactions of the risks of sort of selling and talking too much about the outcomes and the benefits of supporting mutual aid versus the risks of doing so?
It's a hard question. Actually, Rurik gave an answer to this that really resonated with me, as well as raising questions when he said that, I think he said we have to bring up the voices of the people to those trying to enact changes. So I received it as to the politicians and decision makers. So for them to hear more directly about the changes that are happening and about people who are living that change is one way to it. For me, the question that it raises is what I've heard from the traditional aid system as evidence and what constitutes evidence. And I think we need a conversation around what evidence is enough. Is there evidence that's ever going to be enough to influence them? the aid system. So where are the incentive in the traditional aid system? And I will diplomatically move into what, as Resilio, we are going to do. And we are going to focus on directing resources to mutual aid and learning from mutual aid. And we're going to spend less time investing in trying to convince politicians and decision makers. Because I think that this is a moment where traditional aid needs to be decentered for the sake of the work and the changes that need to happen. And I think the answer to a lot of questions that will be raised will really come from the work itself and the changes that are happening. And there are some changes that we are anticipating are going to happen. And there are some changes that we're not anticipating or that we weren't anticipating at the beginning. So I'm hearing more and more about how mutual aid is contributing to social cohesion, etc. So I think if we center the learning, or at least at Resilio, we're going to center the learning on what communities are learning from each other in different sides of the globes, what partners who are supporting and identifying communities are learning within their work and from each other. And hopefully the learning that comes from this becomes sufficient evidence to convince the system and the infrastructure around them. And that's the best offering we'll have. But I'm very curious to see what my friends on the panel are thinking about it from the institutional hat that they're wearing. I think our dream at Resilio is really for mutual aid to become a normal other way of doing humanitarian relief, and then everybody will have the freedom to make a choice of, is this a moment where I go to traditional aid because that's what the moment call and that's what my incentive allows, or is this really a moment to invest in this other way of doing business?
Thank you very much, Fanta. And I do have a final question for Seema. And this question, I think, really speaks to the experience of support to life, but also what's been happening in Turkey with the SELR approach. So, Seema, the question is, how can mutual aid be supported not only during a crisis, but also throughout recovery and long-term rebuilding? How do you see the role of mutual aid alongside an established civil society? But there was a final element, which I think talks a lot to your experience of what role should intermediaries play in mutual aid efforts. And there was a lot of sort of added nuance on the issue of exit strategies and yeah, what a genuine role of an intermediary should be. So there's a few elements there, but I wanted to give you the chance to also comment.
Sure. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Well, in fact, we have started in my organization, we've started using community-led work in response to forest fires. And it wasn't the response itself. It was actually better preparing communities for what will happen again. We know that with climate change, climate-induced disasters are more to come. And communities feel this very, very powerfully. They feel, the direct impact of the climate changing on their crops, on their farms. So for us, it was very, exciting to see that the communities are well aware of the changes that are taking place, and they're not particularly focused only on the response, but how do they adjust their livelihoods? How do they prepare better? How do they reduce the risks? So when you leave it up to communities to decide, okay, here we have some resources, some funding coming in, what would you like to do with it as a community? In the humanitarian system, of course, we're very much focused on relief and response, but this is not at all what communities prioritize. So for us, it's also really broadened our vision of how we see the work that we do, really focusing on the whole disaster risk management cycle and not just the post-disaster work. And in terms of an exit strategy, I mean, for my organization, we feel like our role is evolving. So we don't see this necessarily as an exit for ourselves, but looking at how we can situate ourselves better to create that connection with affected communities, with at-risk communities, and help them carry out their work as a community in solidarity. Because, Fanta has said this so well, mutual work is already there. I mean, in Turkey also, we have a very strong community. We actually have a Turkish name for it, imece, which means working together, doing together. So this is actually a natural part of communities supporting each other and working together. So it's just a matter of how do we make that more visible? How do we strengthen that? How do we support that further? And what our role can be as an intermediary, as we see ourselves more and more as a national organization, because we are able to reach out to various communities within the country. So that's where we see our role evolving.
Thank you so much, Sima, and thank you, everyone. We've come to an end, but I wanted to thank you all for your interest and time. We had over 300 participants join our chat. Thank you to all of our speakers and all those that are involved in supporting and contributing to this research. As it was mentioned in the chat, this is not the end of the conversation, but actually just the beginning. This is the first report of a multi-year, multi-phase research project that ALNAP is advancing in collaboration with many partners. We're about to engage in 5 new country case studies where we're going to look at these specific questions in greater depth. So please stay tuned. Please join us through the journey of this important conversation. We have shared a survey on the chat, and we would really appreciate if you can take the time. It takes around 2 minutes to just give us some quick feedback. We will also be hosting a mutual aid event during HNPW. So if you're around, please make sure to also join. And thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Ciao. Hasta luego.